Okay, so we are talking now about Act 1, Scene 2, which opens in a camp near Forres, which is a place in Scotland. So we've got a setting in Scotland here. Um, Before we start to talk through this scene, I just want to remind you once again, you should not be watching this unless you have a physical copy of the script in front of you that you can annotate, and your exercise book as well. You should also have already read the scene previously to get a sense of what is going on. Okay? And if, as you're reading through these Shakespearean scenes, you're struggling with some of the language, that's perfectly fine. I would strongly recommend using online tools, things like Spark Notes, York Notes, stuff like that, to get brief summaries of what's going on in the scene before you read them. And then you can really see how the language can elevate that plot, and you can really understand what's going on. Okay, so there's kind of no problem with using things like those. The No Fear Shakespeare also works quite well for seeing some translations of the language, but it's very important to remember that when we're analyzing and when we're discussing this text, we're looking at the original, we're looking at Shakespeare's words, because that's where the real beauty of the magic of this play is, okay? Not translations done by someone into modern day English online. So they're there to help understand a little bit more about the plot, but they're not really there for you to work out the language and the character and the themes and all of those sorts of things, right? We really need to get into the text for that. So I'm not going to be making any reference to them personally. So we open with a camp near Forres, and we open with alarum within. So alarum means battle sounds, essentially. So where Act 1, Scene 1 opened with thunder and lightning, Act 1, Scene 2 opens mid-battle. So once again, chaos highlighted. The beginning of this play is hectic. We're middle of a storm, middle of a battle. And everything's chaotic, everything's crazy, and this play never really slows down that much. It's pretty intense from the get go. It's actually one of the shortest tragedies and one of the shortest plays that Shakespeare ever wrote, and that's just because from beginning to end, it's just kind of blood and death and murder and darkness and all of those sorts of things bundled in, which is always fun. And we have enter Duncan, Malcolm, Donalbain, Lennox with attendants meeting a bleeding sergeant. Okay, so they're in the middle of the war, and I'm just going to talk about some characters here. Duncan refers to King Duncan. He is the current king of Scotland at this point in the play. Okay, so he would be very much seen on stage coming on. He'd probably have a crown on, sword, all of those sorts of things. Malcolm and Donalbain are his children. Malcolm, his older son, Donalbain, his younger son. And then Lennox and the other people we meet in here in this play are thanes. When you see the word thane, that is equivalent of lord. It means that they're a nobleman. They are a lord of a certain area, and so they're one of the king's thanes. It's a Scottish word, and it just indicates that they're one of those nobility. And if you're the thane of somewhere, it means that you represent that area. Now, sometimes you'll see thane of somewhere being referred to their place. So, for example, in this scene, the Thane of Cawdor, which is the lord of an area of Scotland called Cawdor, is sometimes just called Cawdor as his name. So that's something to look out for. This was very common in English and Scottish plays at the time. It was the way that people spoke about things. Again, when we talk about establishing theme, establishing tone, I talked last time about how this play is filled with darkness and blood, and you'll be able to see that from the language. Duncan's first lines, the King of Scotland, is, "What bloody man is that?" And already we're presented in this first scene by a man bleeding out, this bleeding sergeant that they meet. And we're introduced to the idea of revolt, of revolution. He can report as seemeth by his plight of the revolt, the newest state. So what is this war that they're in the middle of? They're in the middle of a revolt. People have tried to rise up against King Duncan, and he's having to shut that down. There's a civil war going on. So already ideas of overthrowing the king, of revolution, of standing up to kill or get rid of the current order of things are introduced very, very early on in this play. Now, I'm not going to read through every single line here, but essentially the conclusion is that MacDonald, sometimes called McDonald, sometimes, depending on your script, called McDonwold, but it's pronounced McDonald, just like the fast food chain. McDonald is the guy who rose up to try and defeat King Duncan and to try and overthrow King Duncan. And the conclusion of this scene is that he failed, and they managed to defeat Duncan. They managed to defeat McDonald. Sorry, Duncan's armies managed to defeat McDonald's, and he was destroyed. And the main person that was really the key in doing that was brave Macbeth. He is introduced in this scene by other people. We haven't met him yet, okay? He's talked about already in Act 1, Scene 1 by the witches. Now he's talked about in Act 1, Scene 2 by the king and his attendants. And we haven't even met him yet, so we don't meet him until Act 1, Scene 3. But there's this really nice sense of kind of building up towards him. We know the witches are talking about him and they planned something for him, and now we know that the king and his attendants are all talking about Macbeth as well. So before we come back to Macbeth, I just want to talk about some language here to talk about MacDonald and the rebels and how they are described. There's a really great line here where he says, "The merciless MacDonald, worthy to be a rebel, for to that the multiplying villainies of nature do swarm upon him." What does this mean? He's suggesting that because MacDonald is a rebel, that all the evils of nature, all the bad things in this world, end up swarming to him. It's an implication that evil begets evil, that if you do bad things will come back to you. A sense of karma, a sense of, you get what you give. And in this situation, he's saying that MacDonald, he's worthy to be a rebel because at the end of the day, all the bad things came back and they ended up defeating him. And fortune turned against him in the end. And then they talk about Macbeth. He's introduced quite quickly. For brave Macbeth, notice in this scene they compliment him a lot. Brave Macbeth, well he deserves that name of brave Macbeth. Disdaining fortune with his brandished steel, which smoked with bloody execution, like Valor's minion carved out his passage till he faced the slave. So he's saying, out of all this battle, Macbeth appears, and he's described here as Valor's minion, so described as Valor, if you imagine personifying valor and bravery as a kind of god. He's bravery's favourite person. He's bravery's appointee on earth. Valor's appointee on earth, carving out his passage. You imagine him just cutting his way through the army here with his sword, with smoked with bloody execution. Again, this language is really dark. So his first introduction we have of Macbeth is a really violent, really brutal one, but one that shows that they really, really respect him. And then he met MacDonald. He faced the slave, as they call him, till he unseamed him from the nave to the chaps and fixed his head upon our battlements. So he sliced him from the nave, his belly button, up to his chaps, or his chops, which are his cheeks. He sliced his jaw. He sliced him from his belly button through to his up to his jaw, chopped off his head, and put his head on the battlements. So our first introduction of Macbeth is him doing some pretty brutal stuff. We get the immediate idea that he is brave, he is strong, he is a great warrior, but also he is a very violent man. He is a man of action. While this war is going on, he just cuts through everyone, he gets to the leader, and he murders them, and just takes off their head and puts it on a stake on the battlements. Now, Duncan, super happy about this, Oh, valiant cousin, oh, worthy gentleman. Duncan really respects him. So the king already really respects Macbeth for this situation. Now, there's more description of kind of the war and what's going on. We get more ideas of shipwrecking storms and direful thunders breaking. So the the storm seems to be coming to an end now that MacDonald is defeated. There's some pathetic fallacy going on there, that while the war was going on, there was a storm, but now it's ending. The storm seems to be coming to an end, and things start to be getting better. But then there are some issues. The sergeant talks about a fresh assault beginning. He said even though that started to get better, a fresh assault took place. And then we get introduced to another character, Banquo. Dismayed not this, our captains, Macbeth and Banquo. Were they not upset by this? And Banquo is talked about as well as being a great captain. Banquo is a good friend of Macbeth. They worked together to fight this. But Macbeth is the one that they're really talking about here. And they talk about the fact that Macbeth and Banquo did not have any issue with this fresh assault, and they ended up just completely destroying them. And again, you get really violent, dark language, like bathe in reeking wounds, and all of those sorts of things. So we're introduced to this bloody battlefield, and this image of Macbeth and Banquo fighting through, but Macbeth particularly, this kind of bloody executioner that just has absolutely turned the tide of the battle. The Thane of Ross arrives, and Ross gives some more information. So Ross, the Thane of Ross, again described as Ross here, he comes and he introduces another little plot point. He says that there is another traitor who was working with MacDonald, the Thane of Cawdor. Here we see, assisted by that most disloyal traitor, the Thane of Cawdor began a dismal conflict. So just when they thought they were winning, the Thane of Cawdor, assisted by Norway, so some Norwegian banners and Norwegian kings coming over, began a dismal conflict. So we see that this revolt is being supported by the Kingdom of Norway as well. And there's just some interesting political stuff happening there. You can look at that yourself. But once again, the Thane of Cawdor began a dismal conflict till that Bellona's bridegroom. So Bellona's bridegroom here is a reference to Macbeth. Bellona is the goddess of war, okay, classically. And to say Bellona's bridegroom is to describe Macbeth as the husband of the goddess of war. That's how they're seeing him at this point. Till that Bellona's bridegroom, lapped in proof, confronted him with self-comparisons, point against point, rebellious, arm against arm, curbing his lavish spirit, and to conclude, the victory fell on us. So, not only did Macbeth defeat MacDonald, but also the Norwegian armies came over, and the Thane of Cawdor, who they thought was on their side, turned out to be a traitor as well, and he turned against them, and Macbeth killed him too. Nobody could get past Macbeth. Now, Duncan's super happy about this, and it's all the end of that. So they've got all this. It's over. Note that it said the victory fell on us. They didn't describe Macbeth killing the Thane of Cawdor. Sorry, Cawdor's not yet been killed by Macbeth, just captured. But Duncan later on says, "No more that Thane of Cawdor shall deceive our bosom interest. Go pronounce his present death." So he's saying, go kill the Thane of Cawdor. He needs to be dead, and with his former title, greet Macbeth. So that's the honour that they're bestowing on Macbeth. They're saying, okay, the Thane of Cawdor, he turned against us, you defeated him, we're going to kill him, and we're going to make you Thane of Cawdor as well. Now, Macbeth is already Thane of Glamis, which is another place in Scotland, but his lands are going to grow because he's done so well here. I'll see it done. What he hath lost, noble Macbeth hath won. Note again the way they talk about Macbeth in the scene. Noble Macbeth, brave Macbeth. They love Macbeth. He is the absolute hero of this war. And he's already, before we've met him, got this clear image in our head of him being this man of action, this great fighter, this bloody executioner, the sort of man that can really turn the tide of a battle. That image in our heads is the one that's going to stick when we then meet him in the next scene, which I will talk about on my next MacBinge Screencast.